Stay. The word was a tiny, fragile whisper, the first one she had spoken in a year, and it shattered the frozen silence of the billionaire's penthouse. Tanisha Williams, the maid he had pulled from a snow-swept street, froze, her hand on her packed bag. She looked from the traumatized child who had finally found her voice to the powerful, grieving man who had failed to use his. She knew in that moment this was no longer about needing a home. It was about whether she had the courage to build one from the pieces of their broken hearts. Welcome back to Epic Narrative Tales. Grab your blanket and popcorn and enjoy the ride. The cold was a thief. It stole the feeling from Tanisha Williams's fingers and toes, stole the breath from her lungs, and was now trying to steal the last, stubborn embers of her hope. She sat hunched on a bench at a deserted bus stop, the biting New York wind slicing through her thin coat like a razor. Snowflakes, hard and sharp as bits of glass, stung her cheeks. Just an hour ago, she'd had a job, a place to be. Now, she had nothing. Her last client, a woman with a penthouse on the Upper East Side and a voice as cold as the marble floors Tanisha had just polished, had been in a foul mood. She'd found a single imagined streak on a crystal glass and had unleashed a torrent of abuse. "This is unacceptable," she had sneered, her voice dripping with disdain. "I pay for perfection. Clearly, you are not capable of it." "Ma'am, I can rewash it," Tanisha had said, her own voice tired, her body aching from a 12-hour shift. "Don't bother," the woman had snapped. "Your services are no longer required. Get out." She had thrust a fraction of the wages Tanisha was owed into her hand and had shown her the door, dismissing her as easily as she would a piece of trash. And now, here she was, stranded. The bus was late, or maybe it wasn't coming at all. Her meager pay wouldn't be enough for a cab, and the small room she rented was a world away. She buried her face in her hands, the rough, chapped skin a testament to a life of hard work that never seemed to be enough. She wasn't just cold, she was soul-weary, tired of being invisible, tired of being less than. Miles above the city, in a penthouse that looked down on the world from the clouds, Klaus von Schroeder was also in a cold, silent room, but his was a cold of the spirit. He stood at the edge of his daughter's bedroom, a vast, beautiful space filled with the most expensive toys imaginable, all of them untouched. His daughter, 7-year-old Lily, sat on the floor, not playing, but simply existing. She was building a small, perfect tower of blocks, her movements precise, silent, and utterly without joy. It had been a year since his wife, his vibrant, laughing Clara, had been taken by a sudden illness, and in the deafening silence that followed, his daughter had disappeared too. She had retreated into a world of her own, a fortress of silence from which no doctor, no therapist, no desperate, pleading father could coax her out. She had not spoken a single word in 365 days. "Lilibach," Klaus said, his voice with its faint, lingering German accent feeling unnaturally loud in the quiet room. "The snow is here. Remember how you and Mommy used to catch the flakes on your tongue?" Lily didn't look up. Her small hand placed another block on the tower with unwavering precision. He was a ghost in his own daughter's life. He was the head of a global financial empire, a man who could command the attention of world leaders with a single phone call, but he could not command a single glance from his own child. He was failing, utterly and completely. The emptiness of his life was a vast, echoing canyon. He turned and walked away, the silence of the house pressing in on him. He needed to escape. He grabbed his coat, his keys, and went down to the garage. He would drive. It was the only thing he did anymore that felt like he was moving forward, even if he was just going in circles. He helped a silent Lily into the back seat of his black Maybach, the car a silent, armored tomb, and pulled out into the snow-swept streets of New York, a king driving through a kingdom of his own grief, completely unaware that he was about to collide with a woman who was praying for a miracle. Tanisha and Klaus are both trapped in their own kind of cold, one external and one internal. Do you believe that our moments of deepest despair are sometimes a preparation for an unexpected grace? Let me know your thoughts on fate and divine encounters in the comments below. The Maybach moved through the snow-swept streets like a silent, black phantom. Inside, the world was a muffled hush, the chaos of the city reduced to a distant, silent film. Klaus drove with no destination, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his mind a maelstrom of self-recrimination and grief. In the rearview mirror, he could see the top of Lily's head, her gaze fixed on the blur of lights and snow outside her window. She was a million miles away. He made a turn, leaving the garish lights of Midtown behind and headed down a quieter, darker avenue. The snow was falling thicker now, a curtain of white that softened the hard edges of the city. He was lost in his own thoughts when a small, almost imperceptible movement from the back seat broke his trance. Lily, who hadn't shown an interest in the outside world in a year, was leaning forward. Her small hand, clad in a white mitten, was pressed against the cold glass of the window. She was pointing. "What is it, Lilybug?" Klaus asked, his voice gentle, not daring to hope. She didn't answer, of course. She just kept pointing, her gaze fixed on a lone figure huddled on a bench at a snow-covered bus stop. A woman, barely visible through the swirling snow, shivering under the weak, flickering light. Any other night, Klaus would have driven on. He was a man insulated from the world's casual suffering. He wrote checks to charities, large, impersonal sums that kept the harsh realities of life at a comfortable, manageable distance. But Lily was pointing. In the dead, silent landscape of her apathy, this was a seismic event. It was the first sign of life, the first flicker of interest in another human being he had seen in a year. He followed his daughter's gaze to the woman on the bench. He saw her thin coat, her hunched posture, the way she rubbed her hands together in a futile attempt to generate warmth. He saw her desperation. He didn't know why, but his daughter was seeing something, and in his desperate father's heart, he needed to know what it was. He slowed the car, pulling over to the curb just past the bus stop. The sudden, silent arrival of the impossibly long, impossibly black car made Tanisha flinch. She looked up, her body tensing, preparing for the worst. A security guard telling her to move on? Someone looking for trouble? The back window glided down with a soft, expensive hum. Through the falling snow, she saw the face of a little girl, pale and serious, her eyes wide and full of a strange, solemn curiosity. Then the driver's side door opened. A man emerged, tall and imposing, his expensive wool coat a shield against the storm. He moved with an aura of quiet, immense power. He looked at her, and his eyes, a startlingly clear, piercing blue, were not filled with pity or contempt, but with the same intense, searching curiosity as the child's. "The bus isn't coming," he said, his voice a low, formal rumble with that faint German accent. "Not in this weather." "I'll manage," Tanisha said, her voice tight with pride that was all she had left. "No," he said, the word a simple, inarguable fact. "You won't. You are freezing, and my daughter, she saw you." He glanced back at the car, at the small, pale face pressed against the glass. Tanisha's gaze followed his. She looked at the little girl, and her maternal heart, a thing she had been forced to keep locked away, gave a painful lurch. The child looked so fragile, so sad. Klaus made a decision. It was not logical. It was not rational. It was a desperate, impulsive leap of faith, a father following the silent, mysterious guidance of his broken child. He chose his words with a strange, formal precision, as if he were making a business proposition. "She needs a home," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an immense, desperate weight. He nodded towards Tanisha, his gaze direct and unwavering. My child needs someone to call mother." The world seemed to stop. The wind, the snow, the distant city hum, it all faded away, leaving only the three of them suspended in this bizarre, impossible moment. Tanisha stared at him, her mind unable to process the words. Was this a cruel joke? Was he a madman?
She searched his face, looking for a sign of mockery, of insanity, but she found none. She saw only a desperate, profound, and soul-deep exhaustion, a grief that mirrored her own. He wasn't offering charity. He wasn't propositioning her. It was something far stranger, far rawer. It was a plea. A man standing on the edge of his own personal abyss was reaching out, not for himself, but for his child. Before she could form a reply, before she could tell him he was crazy, the back door of the car opened. The little girl, Lily, stepped out into the snow. She walked slowly, deliberately towards Tanisha. She stopped a few feet away, her wide, silent eyes fixed on Tanisha's face. Then her small hand, clad in a white mitten, was pressed against the cold glass of the window. She was held out. It was an invitation, a silent, powerful plea that was 1,000 times more potent than her father's strange, desperate words. Tanisha looked from the child's outstretched hand to the father's haunted eyes, and she knew she was standing at a crossroads. Behind her was the cold, the street, the crushing, hopeless weight of her life. Before her was this strange, impossible, and terrifying door. God, she had prayed, just give me a warm, safe place. She never imagined it would look like this. With her heart pounding, her body shivering, and a spirit that had nothing left to lose, she reached out and took the little girl's hand.
The inside of the Maybach was another world, a silent, leather-scented sanctuary that moved through the storm-ravaged city as if protected by an invisible shield. Tanisha sat in the back, the plush seat swallowing her, with the little girl, Lily, beside her. The child had not let go of her hand. Her small, mittened grip was a constant, warm pressure, a silent anchor in the sea of Tanisha's disbelief. They drove in silence. Tanisha was acutely aware of the man in the front seat, of his occasional, fleeting glances in the rearview mirror. His profile was sharp, severe, like a figure carved on an old coin. He had said nothing more since his shocking offer, as if the words themselves had exhausted his supply of human interaction for the year. The car descended into a private, subterranean garage, and they were whisked into a private elevator that opened not into a lobby, but directly into the heart of a palace. The penthouse was a breathtaking, terrifying expanse of glass, marble, and space. It was 2 stories of minimalist, modernist perfection, with windows that showcased a panoramic, godlike view of the snow-swept city. It was the most beautiful place Tanisha had ever seen, and the saddest. There were no photographs on the walls, no clutter on the tables, no sign that a child's chaotic, joyful life was being lived here. It was a home holding its breath, waiting for an exhale that never came. "The guest suite is this way," Klaus said, his voice flat, gesturing down a long, echoing hallway. The suite was, as Tanisha expected, a masterpiece of understated luxury, but she barely noticed the thread count of the sheets or the brand of the toiletries. Her entire focus was on Lily, who still clung to her hand, her small face pale with exhaustion. "She needs a bath, and to get warm," Tanisha said, her maternal instincts, so long suppressed, taking over completely. It was not a request. It was a gentle, firm command. Klaus looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his cold blue eyes. He was used to giving orders, not taking them. But he simply nodded. "Of course, the nanny usually handles that." "I'm not the nanny," Tanisha replied, her voice soft but clear, "but I know how to care for a child." She led Lily into the magnificent marble bathroom, and as she helped the little girl out of her snow-damp clothes, she felt the true, profound nature of her test begin. This was not about earning her keep or impressing a billionaire. This was about reaching a soul that had locked itself away. She filled the tub, her hands moving with a forgotten, muscle-deep memory of caring for her younger cousins years ago. She didn't press Lily to speak. She didn't bombard her with questions. She just created a space of gentle, quiet care. She hummed a soft, wordless melody as she washed Lily's hair, her fingers massaging the little girl's scalp with a tenderness that was both an offering and prayer.
Lily, who doctors had said would flinch from physical contact, leaned into her touch, her small body finally, infinitesimally beginning to relax. After the bath, wrapped in a towel so plush it was like a cloud, Lily still would not let go of Tanisha's hand, so Tanisha sat on the edge of the bed, holding the little girl's hand until Lily's slow, even breathing announced she was asleep. Only then did she gently slip her hand free. She walked out into the vast, silent living room. Klaus was standing by the window, a dark silhouette against the glittering city lights. "She's asleep," Tanisha said. He nodded, not turning around. "She hasn't let anyone but Clara, her mother, touch her hair since she was a toddler." The admission was a small, fragile thing, offered into the darkness. "She's a sweet girl," Tanisha said. "She's just lost." "We are all lost here," Klaus replied, the words full of a profound, bottomless grief. He finally turned to face her. "You have passed the first part of your interview, Miss Williams. My daughter has chosen you, but the job is not just to be her companion. The job," he said, his gaze intense, "is to bring her back, to make her speak again. That is the only thing I will pay for." The cruelty of the statement, the transactional nature of his hope was a splash of cold water. He had not brought her here for her own sake, or even his. He had brought her here as a last, desperate, and probably foolish hope for his daughter. She was not a guest. She was a gamble, a tool he hoped would fix his broken child. Tanisha felt a surge of her old, defiant pride. "You can't buy a child's healing, Mr. von Schroeder," she said, her voice sharp with a sudden anger. "And you can't hire a miracle. It doesn't work that way. Faith doesn't work that way." "I lost my faith a year ago, Miss Williams," his voice flat and dead. "All I have left is my checkbook. So, do we have a deal, or would you prefer I take you back to your bus stop?" The threat hung in the air, cold and sharp as an icicle. He had her. He knew it. The safety of this house, the warmth, the promise of a future. It was a cage, and the door was closing. She looked from his cold, desperate face to the hallway that led to a sleeping, broken child, and she knew she couldn't leave. Not now. "You and I don't have a deal," Tanisha said, her voice quiet but imbued with a new, unshakable strength. "But your daughter and I, we have an understanding. I'll stay, not for your money, but for her."
Tanisha's first full day in the penthouse was an exercise in navigating a beautiful silence void. The morning sun streamed through the vast windows, illuminating a world of pristine, untouched surfaces. The silence was not peaceful. It was a presence, heavy and suffocating, the sonic ghost of a life that was no longer lived here. She found Klaus already gone, a brief, sterile note left on the kitchen's marble island, informing her that a housekeeper would handle the daily chores and a private chef would prepare all meals. He had provided for her physical needs, but he had left her to navigate the emotional and spiritual emptiness of the house on her own. Lily was in her room, sitting on the floor, already building another one of her silent, perfect towers of blocks. Tanisha entered softly, not with a chipper, forced greeting, but with a quiet, respectful presence. "Good morning, Lily," she said gently, sitting on the floor a few feet away, making herself small. "That's a beautiful tower." Lily didn't respond. Her small hands continued their precise, methodical work. Tanisha didn't push. She knew that trying to force a conversation would be like trying to grab smoke. The wall around Lily was not built of defiance, it was built of trauma. You couldn't knock it down. You had to convince the person inside to open the door. So Tanisha began her work. Her first act of gentle rebellion was to go into the vast, gleaming, industrial-style kitchen, a space that looked like it had never seen a spilled drop of flour. She ignored the private chef's meticulously planned menu and began to cook. She found eggs, butter, flour, sugar, and she began to bake cookies. As she worked, she started to hum. It was a sound as natural to her as breathing. She hummed old, slow gospel tunes, the melodies her own mother used to sing while braiding her hair. The simple, soulful notes were a stark contrast to the penthouse's oppressive silence. They were an offering of warmth, a thread of human sound in a world of glass and steel. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the smell of melting butter, of browning sugar, of warm cinnamon began to fill the vast, empty rooms. It was the scent of home, a scent this house had not known in a very long time. An hour later, a small shadow appeared in the kitchen doorway. It was Lily. She stood just on the threshold, her silent gaze fixed on Tanisha's hands as she placed the golden brown cookies on a cooling rack. She was drawn by a force more powerful than any words, the simple universal promise of something warm and sweet. Tanisha didn't turn around immediately. She just continued her work, humming softly. "They're almost ready," she said, as if she were talking to herself. "Chocolate chip, my favorite." She turned, a warm cookie in her hand, and held it out. "Want one?" Lily hesitated, her gaze flicking from the cookie to Tanisha's face and then back again. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she stepped into the kitchen, took the cookie, and retreated back to the doorway to eat it, her eyes never leaving Tanisha. It was a small, monumental victory, a single step across a border. The days that followed fell into this new rhythm. Tanisha did not try to be a therapist. She just existed. She filled the silence not with demands, but with life. She read books aloud in the living room, sitting on the plush white sofa, turning the pages of old fairy tales, her voice a low, soothing melody, whether Lily was in the room or not. She was creating an atmosphere where listening was a safe and pleasant thing to do. One afternoon, she found an old, beautiful grand piano in a forgotten corner of the penthouse, its keys covered in a thin layer of dust. She sat down, and after a moment's hesitation, began to play. She was not a virtuoso, but she played with a gentle, soulful touch, simple melodies from her childhood church, songs of hope and of grace. She was halfway through Amazing Grace when she felt a presence beside her. Lily had come to stand by the piano, her small hand resting on the polished wood, her head tilted, listening. Her eyes were fixed on Tanisha's hands as they moved over the keys. When Tanisha finished, the final notes hanging in the air like a prayer, Lily didn't move. She just stayed there, sharing the silence that followed, a silence that was no longer empty, but filled with the ghost of a beautiful sound. Tanisha was beginning to understand. Lily's silence was not a void, it was a sanctuary. To bring her back, she couldn't just fill it with noise. She had to fill it with things that were safe, things that were warm, things that were beautiful. Cookies, stories, music. She was not breaking down the walls of the fortress. She was planting a garden outside, hoping the scent of the flowers would eventually coax the lonely princess to the window. A month passed. The sterile, silent penthouse had begun to exhale. The air, once thin and cold, was now frequently filled with the scent of baking, the sound of Tanisha's soft humming, or the quiet murmur of her voice reading a story. Lily remained silent, but her silence had changed. It was no longer a wall. It was a quiet space she was beginning to share. She would follow Tanisha from room to room, a small, watchful shadow. She would sit beside her on the sofa, leaning just slightly against her arm as Tanisha read. She had even, once, brought Tanisha one of her own drawings, a simple, colorful picture of a flower. Klaus, too, was changing. He came home from the office earlier. He would linger in the doorway of the living room, listening to Tanisha read, a strange, unreadable expression on his face. He started joining them for the simple dinners Tanisha insisted on cooking, sitting in the unfamiliar quiet of his own dining table, watching the silent, gentle rapport between his daughter and this woman he had brought in from the storm. The house was slowly, tentatively, beginning to feel less like a mausoleum and more like a home. Tanisha, in her quiet way, was beginning to feel a sense of belonging, a fragile peace she hadn't known was possible. One afternoon, tasked with organizing a little-used storage closet, she found a box of things that had clearly belonged to Clara, Klaus's late wife. Old photo albums, concert tickets, a collection of delicate hand-painted porcelain birds. As she was carefully lifting one of the birds to dust it, a tiny, perfect bluebird with its head tilted as if in song, her foot caught on the edge of a loose floorboard. She stumbled, and the porcelain bird slipped from her grasp. It hit the hardwood floor and shattered into a dozen irreparable pieces. The sound was small, but in the quiet of the house, it was as loud as a gunshot. Tanisha froze, her heart seizing in her chest. She knelt, her hands trembling as she looked at the shattered remains. It was an accident, a stupid, clumsy accident, but she knew, with a sick, sinking feeling, that she had not just broken a piece of porcelain. She had broken something sacred. At that moment, Klaus appeared in the doorway. He had heard the sound from his study. He saw Tanisha kneeling on the floor, and his gaze went from her horrified face to the scattered, broken pieces of the bluebird, and his face changed. The thaw, the slow, cautious softening of the past month, it all vanished in an instant. The ice returned, colder and harder than ever before. His jaw clenched, and a look of such profound, glacial anger and pain in his eyes that Tanisha physically recoiled. "That was hers," he said, his voice a low, dead thing. "It was her favorite, from our honeymoon in Vienna." "Klaus, I am so sorry," Tanisha whispered, her own voice trembling. "It was an accident. I tripped." He didn't seem to hear her. He was staring at the broken bird as if he was staring at his wife's body all over again. The small, accidental death of this object had ripped open the wound of her death, and all the raw, unhealed grief came pouring out, not as sadness, but as a cold, cutting rage. "Leave it," he said, his voice flat and sharp as a shard of glass. "The housekeeper will dispose of it, and of you if you ever go in here again." He turned and walked away without another word, leaving her kneeling on the floor amidst the wreckage. The warmth, the connection, the fragile budding hope of the past month, it was all gone, shattered as completely as the porcelain bird. For the next 2 days, the house was a tomb again. The silence returned, but this time it was not empty. It was thick with a cold, hostile tension. Klaus retreated completely. He spoke only to give orders, his voice clipped and formal, his eyes looking straight through Tanisha as if she were a ghost. He started taking his meals in his study. The quiet, shared moments vanished. Tanisha felt the change like a physical blow. She had been demoted. She was no longer a partner in healing. She was just the help again, a clumsy employee who had broken something precious. The fragile sense of belonging she had started to feel was revealed to be an illusion, a temporary pass into a world where she would never truly belong. The grief that still ruled this house had just reminded her with brutal efficiency that she was an outsider. And the man who had started to look at her with something like hope now looked at her with the cold, unforgiving eyes of a stranger. Tanisha spent 2 days walking on eggshells in a house that had suddenly become a minefield. Every creak of a floorboard, every accidental clink of a dish felt like a transgression. She continued her rituals, reading to a now confused Lily, humming in the kitchen, but the joy was gone. She was performing a role, a ghost of the warmth she had brought into this home. The coldness emanating from Klaus was a constant, oppressive weight, a silent accusation that made her feel like a trespasser in her own life. She could leave. It would be the easy thing to do. She had fulfilled the letter of her strange contract, if not the spirit. She could take the generous pay she had earned, find a small apartment for herself and Leo, who was now healthy and thriving in a local school she had enrolled him in, and disappear. She could retreat back to a world she understood, a world of struggle, yes, but one free of this complex, heartbreaking grief. But then she would see Lily. The little girl, so sensitive to the emotional currents of the house, was regressing. She was quieter, her eyes wider, more fearful. She had started clinging to Tanisha's hand again, not with the easy affection of the past weeks, but with a desperate, anxious grip, as if she too feared Tanisha would shatter and disappear. Tanisha knew she couldn't leave. Not for Klaus, not for herself, but for the little girl who was caught in the crossfire of a ghost and a memory. That night, after Lily was asleep, Tanisha made her decision. She was not going to let his grief win. She was not going to let a ghost evict her from this fragile, budding family. She walked down the long, silent hallway and stopped at the door to his study. She could see the sliver of light from under the door. She knocked softly. "What is it?" His voice was muffled, annoyed. She opened the door and stepped inside. He was sitting at his massive desk, surrounded by stacks of papers, a glass of whiskey glowing amber under the desk lamp. He looked up, and his face was a mask of cold fury. "I said I did not wish to be disturbed." "I'm not here to disturb you, Klaus," she said, her voice quiet but unshakable. She closed the door behind her, a small, definitive click. "I'm here to talk about your wife." The name hung in the air between them, a forbidden word. His eyes narrowed. "You will not speak of her." "I have to," Tanisha insisted, taking a step closer, "because she is the loudest person in this house. She is in every silent room, at every empty chair at the dinner table, and you are letting her ghost destroy what's left of your family." "You have no right," he began, rising from his chair. "I have every right," she countered, her voice rising with a passion that stunned him into silence. "I have the right of someone who held your daughter while she cried in her sleep. I have the right of someone who has spent a month trying to breathe life back into a house that is suffocating in sadness. And I have the right of someone who knows what it's like to lose someone." She walked closer, her gaze direct, her quiet strength a tangible force. "I am sorry I broke that bird. I am so sorry for that. But you are not angry about a piece of porcelain, Klaus. You are angry because for a second you let yourself feel something again. You let a little bit of warmth in, and it terrified you. Because you feel like if you stop grieving for one single moment, you are betraying her." He sank back into his chair, the anger draining out of him, leaving only the raw, gaping wound of his pain. She sat in the chair opposite his desk. "My mother," she said, her voice softening, becoming a shared confidence in the quiet room. "She died when I was 15, cancer. It was slow and it was hard. For a year after she was gone, I kept her room exactly as she had left it. I wouldn't let anyone touch anything. I kept her perfume on the dresser, her book on the nightstand. It was my shrine. And I thought, just like you, that if I moved anything, I would be erasing her." She looked at him, her eyes shining with a deep shared understanding. "But I wasn't honoring her. I was trapping her, and I was trapping myself with her. It wasn't until I packed her things, until I gave her favorite sweater to my aunt, until I finally opened the window and let the air in. That was the first time I could remember her smile without also feeling the pain. Honoring them doesn't mean you have to stop living, Klaus. It means you have to live enough for both of you." Her words, born of her own hard-won wisdom, were a key, unlocking a door in his heart he had sealed shut a year before. He finally looked at her, and the cold, angry billionaire was gone. In his place was just a man, heartbroken and lost. He buried his face in his hands, and a single ragged sob escaped him. It was the first time he had truly cried since the day she died. Tanisha didn't move. She didn't touch him. She just sat there, a quiet, steady presence in the storm, giving him the one thing he had not allowed himself, a safe space to finally, truly grieve. After a long time, he looked up, his eyes red-rimmed but clearer than she had ever seen them. "I am sorry, Tanisha," he whispered, the apology for so much more than a harsh word. "For my coldness, for everything." "I know," she said softly. He looked at her, at this woman who had come into his life like a force of nature, who had weathered his storm and met his grief not with fear, but with a grace he had never known.
The connection they had been building was not just a fragile bond anymore. It had been tested by the fire of his grief, and it had not broken. It was real. It was strong. And in the quiet of his study, amidst the ghosts of his past, he realized that she was the one who was reawakening his soul.
The weeks that followed the night in the study marked a profound shift. The house was no longer holding its breath. It was beginning to breathe again. Klaus, having finally allowed himself to truly grieve, was a different man. The cold, distant shell had fallen away, revealing a warmth and a gentle humor Tanisha had never seen. He started leaving the office at a reasonable hour. He started sitting with Lily and Tanisha in the evenings, not as a watchful ghost, but as an active participant, his low laugh becoming a new, welcome sound in the once silent rooms. He and Tanisha developed an easy, comfortable rhythm, a partnership built on a foundation of shared vulnerability and mutual respect. They were not yet lovers, but they were more than friends. They were two wounded souls cautiously, hopefully building a new kind of family. But the world outside their quiet sanctuary had not forgotten them, and one crisp autumn afternoon, that world came knocking. The doorbell chimed, and when Tanisha opened the door, a woman stood there who was the living, breathing embodiment of the world Klaus had left behind. She was tall, impossibly elegant, dressed in a sharp Chanel suit, her blonde hair swept into a perfect chignon. Her eyes, the same piercing blue as Klaus's, held a look of cold, immediate disapproval as they swept over Tanisha. "I am Helen von Schröder," the woman announced, her voice crisp and carrying the same faint German accent, but without any of Klaus's warmth. "Klaus's sister-in-law, Clara's sister. And you must be the help." The words were not a question, they were a verdict, a neat and dismissive categorization. Before Tanisha could respond, Helen had brushed past her and swept into the grand foyer, her presence an immediate, invasive chill. Klaus emerged from his study, his face tightening the moment he saw her. "Helen, you should have called." "And give you a chance to hide her?" Helen retorted, her gaze flicking back to Tanisha with undisguised contempt. "I think not. I came to see my niece, and to see for myself what has become of my late sister's home." Helen's visit was not a social call. It was an inspection, an invasion. For the next hour, she moved through the penthouse like a conquering general, her eyes cataloging every change. She saw the children's books on the coffee table, the half-finished cookie on a plate in the kitchen, a colorful drawing of Tanisha's pinned to the refrigerator. Each small sign of life, of warmth, of a new family taking root was, in Helen's eyes, a desecration of her sister's memory. She found Lily in her room, sitting on the floor with Tanisha, the two of them building a complex city out of Legos. "Lily, darling," Helen cooed, her voice a sickly sweet poison. "Come give your Tante Helen a hug. You remember me, don't you?" Lily, who had been getting more and more comfortable with Tanisha, immediately froze. She looked at the strange, imposing woman and then back at Tanisha, her eyes wide with a familiar fear. She shrank back, hiding behind Tanisha's legs. Helene's smile tightened. Her gaze fell on Tanisha, cold and sharp. "It seems the staff has gotten a little too familiar," she said, her voice a low, vicious whisper meant only for Tanisha to hear. "You would do well to remember your place." The attack was a declaration of war. Helen had come here to reclaim what she saw as her family's territory. She saw Tanisha not as a healer, but as a usurper, an uneducated, lower-class woman who had somehow bewitched her grieving brother-in-law and erasing her sister's memory. For the rest of the week, Helen was a constant, toxic presence. She made a great show of reorganizing Clara's belongings, her every action a pointed reminder to Tanisha that she was an outsider. She would speak to Klaus in rapid, exclusive German in front of Tanisha. She would correct Tanisha's grammar, question her cooking, and make small, cutting remarks about her clothes.
It was a subtle, insidious campaign of psychological warfare, designed to undermine Tanisha's confidence and drive a wedge between her and Klaus. Tanisha weathered it all with a quiet, dignified grace, refusing to be drawn into Helen's games. But the constant veiled hostility began to take its toll, casting a shadow over the fragile peace of the home. The conflict was no longer internal, a battle against grief. It was now a public, deeply personal battle for Tanisha's very right to exist in this family, with Helen as the self-appointed gatekeeper of a dead woman's memory. The stage was being set for a final, brutal confrontation that would force Klaus to make a choice, not just between two women, but between the past and the future.
The breaking point came on a Sunday. Helene, with a theatrical sigh, had declared that the house needed to feel like a family again and had insisted on a proper family dinner. It was a transparent power play, an opportunity for her to preside over the dinner table that had once been her sister's and to put Tanisha firmly in her place. The atmosphere in the grand dining room was thick with a tension so profound it was a physical presence. Klaus sat at the head of the table, looking deeply uncomfortable, caught in the crossfire between the ghost of his past and the hope for his future. Tanisha sat to his right, her posture a study in quiet, graceful composure. Lily sat between them, a small, silent barometer of the room's emotional weather, her gaze flicking nervously from her father to her aunt. Helene, at the opposite end of the table, held court. She steered the conversation exclusively to memories of Clara, recounting old family vacations, inside jokes, and society events, each story a gilded brick in the wall she was building around Klaus and Lily, a wall designed to keep Tanisha out. "Do you remember, Klaus," Helene said, her voice dripping with nostalgic sweetness, "the summer we spent in Gstaad? Clara was so radiant. She had a custom-made Dior gown for the benefactor's ball. A true lady, from a true family. Lineage is so important, isn't it? It's the one thing money can't buy." The jab was aimed directly at Tanisha, at her humble origins, at her very otherness. Tanisha felt the sting, but her expression remained serene. She would not give Helene the satisfaction of a reaction. But Helene was just getting started. As the main course was served by a silent uniformed staff member, she fixed her cold blue eyes on Tanisha. "You know, Tanisha," she said, her voice deceptively gentle, "it is truly remarkable what you've accomplished, to come from, well, from your circumstances, and to find yourself in a place like this. It's a real Cinderella story." She paused, letting the condescending words hang in the air. "But we must be careful not to confuse the little girl. We wouldn't want her to think that a temporary arrangement could ever replace the mother she truly lost, a mother of her own breeding." It was a monstrous, unforgivable statement. It was a direct, public attack on Tanisha's role, her character, and her very worthiness to be in that room, in that child's life. In the ringing silence that followed, all eyes went to Klaus. This was his moment. This was the test. Tanisha's heart, which had been so steady, began to pound. She looked at him, a silent, desperate plea in her eyes. "Say something. Defend me. Defend us." Lily, her small face a mask of confusion and fear, also looked at her father. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the cruelty in her aunt's tone. She understood that Tanisha, her safe harbor, was under attack. Klaus looked from Helene's smug, triumphant face to Tanisha's pained, expectant one. He opened his mouth to speak, but he hesitated. For one single catastrophic second, he hesitated. In that split second of silence, a war raged within him. He saw the face of his late wife, Clara. He saw her sister, the last living link to that part of his life. He felt the immense weight of family duty, of tradition, of a world that operated by a set of cold, unspoken rules about class and breeding. He knew Helene was wrong, monstrously so, but the act of publicly, forcefully rebuking his sister-in-law, of declaring this new, fragile, and unconventional family as his own, it required a courage he had not yet fully summoned. His hesitation, his fleeting, cowardly pause, was all the answer Tanisha needed. In that silence, she did not hear a man gathering his thoughts. She heard a final verdict. She heard that when the world pushed, when his past pushed, he would not push back hard enough for her. She was not his partner. She was a complication he was not yet brave enough to fully own. She would always, in the eyes of his world, be the help. Her heart didn't just break, it shattered. The fragile trust she had so cautiously placed in him, the belief that she was finally building a home, it all turned to dust. She stood up, her movement so abrupt that it made the silverware clink. She didn't look at Helen. She didn't look at Lily. She looked only at Klaus, her eyes, which once were so full of warmth and hope, now a pair of dark, wounded voids. "Excuse me," she whispered, her voice a thin, brittle thing. "I'm not feeling well." She turned and walked out of the dining room without another word. It was the quietest, most devastating retreat. Klaus finally found his voice, a strangled "Tanisha," but she was already gone. He was left in the ringing silence with the triumphant, cold smile of his sister-in-law at one end of the table and the wide, terrified, questioning eyes of his silent daughter at the other. He had failed the test. He had chosen silence when he should have chosen her, and in doing so, he had just lost everything he was beginning to realize he couldn't live without. Tanisha walked directly to her room, the sound of the tense, muffled voices from the dining room fading behind her. She didn't cry. She was beyond tears. A cold, hollow clarity had settled over her. She had been a fool to believe. This was not her world. This was not her family. She was a guest, a temporary caregiver, a strange and beautiful interlude in their lives, but she was not, and would never be, one of them. Klaus's hesitation had been the final, brutal confirmation. With a calm, detached efficiency, she began to pack. She folded the simple, elegant clothes he had bought her. She gathered her few toiletries. She was not running away in anger. She was retreating to protect what was left of her own heart. She had survived before him. She would survive after him. She would not stay where she had to be defended. She would go where she was simply accepted. She wrote a short, simple note, not of accusation, but of resignation, leaving it on the perfectly made bed. "Thank you for the sanctuary. It's time for me to go home." Downstairs, the disastrous dinner had ended. Helen, sensing her victory had come at too high a cost, had made a hasty, uncomfortable exit. Klaus was left alone in the vast, silent dining room, the wreckage of the meal a testament to the wreckage of his hopes. The silence that Tanisha's departure had left was a roaring void. He knew, with a certainty that was a physical agony, that he could not let her walk out that door. The thought of this house returning to its cold, silent state, of Lily retreating back into her shell, of his own heart freezing over once more, it was an unbearable, terrifying future. His hesitation at the table had not been a choice. It had been a moment of cowardly paralysis. Now, a choice had to be made, a loud, definitive, and public one. He found his phone and with trembling fingers called his sister-in-law. "Helen," he said, his voice a low, dangerous command, "you will return to my home immediately. You will bring your husband and you will be here in 1 hour. This is not a request." Then he went to Tanisha's room. He stood outside the door for a moment, his heart hammering. He could hear the soft sounds of her packing. He knocked gently. "Tanisha," he said through the door, his voice thick with a regret so profound it was a physical taste. "Please, don't go. Give me 1 hour. 1 hour to prove you wrong. 1 hour to be the man I should have been at that table." He heard the movements inside stop. He didn't know if she would agree, but he had to try. He turned and walked away, a man on a desperate, last-ditch mission to win back his own soul. An hour later, the family was assembled in the grand living room. Helen and her husband sat stiffly on one of the white silk sofas, their faces masks of resentment and confusion. Klaus stood by the fireplace, a commander in his own home.
He had asked Tanisha to be there, and to his immense relief, she stood quietly by the doorway, her bag packed, her face unreadable, a silent observer to this final act. "I have asked you here," Klaus began, his voice ringing with a new, unshakable authority. "This is my home, and Tanisha Williams is a part of it. She is not the help. She is not a temporary arrangement. She is the heart that has started this family beating again." He looked directly at Helen, his eyes blazing with a cold, righteous fury. "You speak of my late wife's memory, Helen. You pretend to be its guardian, but you desecrate it. Clara was a woman of warmth, of grace, of a love that saw no class and no color. She would have been horrified by your cruelty, by your snobbery, by your venom. You are not protecting her legacy. You are twisting it into something ugly and small to justify your own prejudice." Helen scoffed. "Klaus, be reasonable." "I am done being reasonable," he thundered, his voice echoing in the vast room. "I have lived in the shadow of grief for 2 years, and I have allowed that grief and my respect for your family to make me a coward. That ends tonight. Tanisha has brought more healing, more light, and more genuine love into this house in 3 months than any of you have offered in 2 years. She is my partner. She is the mother my child has chosen. And if any of you cannot accept that, if any of you ever show her anything less than the absolute respect she deserves, then you are no longer welcome in this home or in my life. The choice," he finished, his voice dropping to a low, final verdict, "is yours." The silence that followed was absolute. Helen, for the first time in her life, was utterly speechless, her face a mask of shocked, defeated rage. Tanisha stood by the door, her heart pounding, tears streaming down her face. He had done it. He hadn't just defended her, he had championed her. He had chosen her, publicly, loudly, and irrevocably. But the true miracle was yet to come. As Tanisha took a step forward, her bag still at her feet, a tiny, quiet sound broke the silence. "Stay." The word was a fragile, perfect whisper. It came from the corner of the room, where Lily had been sitting, silent and forgotten amidst the adult drama. Everyone turned to stare. Lily was looking directly at Tanisha, her small face a mask of desperate, hopeful urgency. Her eyes, for so long a pair of silent, haunted voids, were now shining with a brilliant, terrifying life. She had spoken. "Lily," Klaus whispered, his own voice breaking. Lily took a hesitant step forward, her gaze never leaving Tanisha. "Please," she said this time, her voice stronger. "Don't go. Stay." Tanisha let out a sob, a sound of pure, overwhelming joy and relief. She rushed forward and knelt, wrapping her arms around the little girl who had just performed a miracle. "I'll stay, baby," Tanisha wept, kissing the top of Lily's head. "I'll stay, I promise." Klaus knelt beside them, his own tears falling freely, wrapping his arms around both of them, the 3 of them a small, unbreakable island of love in the middle of the shocked, silent room. He looked over Lily's head and met Tanisha's tear-filled gaze. He didn't need to say anything. She didn't need to hear it. In the single, miraculous word from a child who would come back from the silent land of grief, everything had been said. This was no longer a house. This was a home, and they, in the most unexpected and beautiful way, were a family.
A house frozen in grief, a man lost in the past, and a child locked in a world of silence. It wasn't a doctor or a therapist who brought them back to life. It was the quiet, patient love of a woman who had nothing and yet gave everything. Image slowly fades to a beautiful cinematic close-up of Lily's face, her eyes bright and full of life as she speaks her first word. Text appears. A single word can break a year of silence. This story reminds us that the greatest cures don't come from a pharmacy, they come from the heart. That a home is not built with money, but with moments, a cookie, a song, a bedtime story. This is the power of the stories we tell at Epic Narrative Tales. We believe that in a world that can feel cold and unforgiving, the most powerful force is still a simple act of human kindness. If this story restored your faith in humanity and you believe that everyone deserves a place to call home, then join our family of story lovers. Subscribe to Epic Narrative Tales and hit the bell so you never miss a story that proves miracles are real. And now, we want to hear about the miracles in your life. Go to the comments and share your story. What is the kindest thing a stranger has ever done for you that felt like a small miracle? Let's fill the comments with hope. Thank you for watching, and may you always be the person who brings warmth to someone else's coldest day.